Dan Haley, the editor of the Wednesday Journal, calls an elected official a terrific, terrific lady. Who is it and why? My name is McKinley Johnson, and I've been a part of Open Door since 2006. During that time, I've been both playwright and director.
And I'm Annie Slavinsky, and I've been connected with Open Door since 2001 as actor, director, and teacher. Now, this episode is the first of two featuring Dan Haley, the editor of the Wednesday Journal and publisher of Growing Community Media. Part one is the story of the people and the places, the trials and the triumphs of building a local community newspaper from the ground up.
Wow.
Now, if you enjoyed today's video, we ask you to please consider making a donation to Open Door. Your support allows this company to continue its storytelling, both on the stage and through these videos.
So visit our website at www.opendoortheater.net and click on that donate button. Any amount will do. Thank you. And now, here is Dan Haley.
I am Dan Haley, editor and publisher of Growing Community Media, Wednesday Journal newspaper. Well, you know, there's the cute story. And we actually did this cute story recently about a young woman in Oak Park, 11, 12 years old, who started a newspaper on her block up somewhere in North Oak Park, and Stacy Sheridan did that story. I did the same thing when I was 10 on 700 block of South Taylor, started a block newspaper. Best thing about it was that we got to use my mom's mimeograph machine in the basement, and the fumes were wonderful. For the old folks who remember mimeograph fluid, it's a good way to get a buzz on. Wasn't what we set out to do, but it's like, wow, this feels good. So I started with the block newspaper. I thought for a long time I'd want to go into politics in some way. And then when I was in college at Roosevelt downtown, I worked on the student newspaper, the Roosevelt Torch. Roosevelt's a very cool place, and the Torch was a very good student newspaper. And I had a lot of opportunity over a couple of years to learn a lot about how you put together a newspaper. And that kind of turned me toward newspapering. I spent a semester at Roosevelt because at that moment I also thought maybe I wanted to go into broadcast journalism, and I interned at WBBM News Radio 78. We sat with the woman I worked for, we sat in this tiny little windowless room, and she was the editorial director of the radio station at a time when they actually ran on-air editorials twice a day, and she wrote them, and I did some of the research. It's one of those moments where I realized that all of the research I was doing was coming out of newspapers. It was the newspapers that were doing the actual reporting on the stories that she editorialized about. And it was like, maybe I should go to work for a newspaper. And that's what I did. After college, I worked for a little newspaper in Oak Park called the Oak Park News, which was failing. And a handful of us tried to find a buyer for the Oak Park News. And its owner was happy and willing because he thought he was going to lose his house over this. But at the last minute, he screwed up the deal. We went out and got local people to put up, I forget, it was tens of thousands of dollars to buy it. At the last minute, he screwed the deal up. And he said, Dan, why don't you guys just come back or just stay and, we'll keep going. And we said, no, we're going to leave and we're going to start our own newspaper. So that was the spring of 1980. And we were, the three of us, Sharon Bridden, Ann Duggan, and I, we were all in our early 20s. None of us had any money. None of our families had any money. And so we went out and sold shares of stock in this non-existent corporation we had formed. And it was, I look back on it now like that was both bold and naive. But this being Oak Park, River Forest, where people have a very high interest in these communities. We found over the course of months 60, 70 people, mostly they put up $1,000 each. We said this is a total flyer and you may never see your money again. And that was almost true, but we survived our first year and went on to gradually have more success. When we started, we were competing with Oak Leaves, the Village Economist, the Oak Park World, and the Little Trib, which was a supplement of the Big Trib. And the Little Trib sold a lot of local ads, and Oak Leaves was dominant. And we had a few ads. If anyone at Pioneer Press had taken us seriously, they could have knocked us over with a feather. We were so close to being gone. But they always denigrated us and said, they're nothing, don't worry about them. And we gradually took hold. We had the support of something that doesn't really exist anymore, and that was independent local banks who wanted to see us succeed. And so Suburban Bank, long gone, now a Fifth Third Bank on Harrison and Oak Park Trust, now Chase. Oak Park Trust bought 2 pages a week from us. They had no reason to buy 2 pages a week from us, but they did, and kept us in business. And then we gradually made a place for ourselves. Oh, I hate the name. I've always hated the name. We had, the three of us, Ann and Sharon and I, we had legal pads filled with names of newspapers, and the time was getting shorter and shorter that we were going to publish the first issue, and we had to put together a, kind of a trial issue to try to show advertisers. And, this was a complete default winner. Wednesday Journal is like, what the hell kind of name is that? Why is Wednesday in the name? So I've never liked the name, but I like the logo, which was designed for us by a couple of local graphic designers who had worked on a project for me a few years earlier when I had started a bookstore, a used bookstore in town, and they designed the logo for the Booksmith, and I asked them to design our logo. I've always thought it was kind of a daffy name for a newspaper. It was default, the default name at the last minute when we had to put something at the top of the front page. I grew up in Oak Park, born in '55. So I grew up in the 60s in Oak Park. Oak Park was a all-white town, fairly conservative politically, although that wasn't anything that I really thought about at that point. It had the blessing of being a pretty economically diverse town, which I also didn't recognize at the moment as a benefit. But, on the block I grew up on Taylor, my dad worked on the west side running warehousing for Brock Candy Company, big employer. My mom taught school. Next door, Richard worked for ComEd, doing, digging holes and, putting pipes in the ground. There was a lawyer down the block, a doctor up the way, a guy who painted houses. There was a cop. It was very diverse that way, and that was great. But it was white, all white. So when the west side of Chicago was resegregating in the 60s in terms of coming out toward Austin, I became really interested in Oak Park, trying to figure out if it was possible to actually create a racially integrated community. It was not considered likely. It had not really happened anywhere in America. And that's really how I got into the idea of starting a newspaper in Oak Park, is because I wanted to write about this experiment, which it was then, and it is now. Different experiment, as we deal with other sorts of diversity and more genuine diversity than just can a black family and a white family live on the same block, but can we really share power and really live together in a socially integrated community? So that is why why I wanted to start a newspaper in Oak Park. And I think it's a great life's work. I think it's got value. I think a strong independent community publisher brings definition to a town. It doesn't bring definition. It allows a town to define itself, because it provides a forum for people to talk to themselves, to see themselves, to argue, to celebrate successes, whether it's a graduation or a political victory, and that connection is very powerful, very, very powerful, and increasingly few communities have that luxury. We've always been a small company. We're as small now because we've shrunk. We're as small now as we've been since, '85. So we have 4 publications: Wednesday Journal, Oak Park River Forest, Austin Weekly News on the west side, Forest Park Review, Riverside Brookfield Landmark. We cover 7 neighborhoods with 4 publications. But we've never managed this company to be as profitable as it might have been. And so one of the ways that shows itself is that each of the 4 papers is really, really local. We're not running recipes, we're not running movie reviews. Everything in the paper is about the town that we cover. And that costs more because you need more people to do that. Even though, traditionally we have, like most people in our industry, we've paid pretty poorly for our editorial staff, which is a source of, I don't feel good about that. When we started, Oak Park and River Forest were a natural combination, kind of a single market, shared the high school. When I was a kid, the more natural combination was Oak Park and Austin in terms of how people lived their lives, as you were much more, at least in central Oak Park or southeast Oak Park, we spent a lot of time on the west side, where we did a lot of shopping and went to the movies and stuff like that. But by 1980, putting Oak Park and River Forest together was a logical combination. We tried initially to buy the paper in Forest Park because we saw Forest Park as the third part of this kind of tri-market entity. The publisher of the Review, Bob Hager, wonderful, wonderful man, great character, was wise enough not to sell his newspaper to us. He said, who the hell are you? And you prove something to me over the next few years, and maybe I'll think about selling my newspaper to you. And so we always wanted to have Forest Park, and I forget now, 3, 4, or 5 years in, Bob and I had always gotten together for lunch a couple times a year at Otto's over in Randolph. It's now a BP station, I think. Otto's was a great little German restaurant. And Bob was kind of sounding us out. and eventually he wanted to retire. And Bob knew that, you know, even though we were just a little newspaper, he knew that Forest Park could not support its own newspaper for long, that as a singular entity, and that it would be better paired with something else. And to our, you know, great, you know, respect for him, he chose us to partner with. So then we had the opportunity to buy the Austin Weekly News, which had been started as a splinter from the Austin Voice. And the husband and wife who had bought who had started the Austin Weekly, Irv Dreckney died young, and his wife decided when we approached her, she decided she was going to sell the paper to us for a very small amount of money. But again, I think she saw us as credible and honorable, and so she sold us the Weekly. The Landmark in Riverside Brookfield was, in Riverside at that point, had come to be owned by Judy Barr Topinka, the state treasurer, a Riverside, or maybe a Cicero native, but lived her adult life in Riverside. She had worked with Bob Hager at the Forest Park Review. They were allegedly a hell of a pair. Their personalities would have been well meshed for fun and adventure. So she had this newspaper kind of in her blood, newspapering, and she had bought the Landmark from the guy who started it, Jim Finnegan. And you know, all the tales about Judy Barr, who went on to be state rep, state senator, state treasurer, all the tales about her being tight with a nickel were true. She wrote a column for the Landmark and stayed on writing a column for us. A surprising number of those columns were about thrift shopping, because she bought all her clothes at yard sales and thrift shops. She was a good woman to be the state treasurer, because she really did think, you know, if I can save $10, I'll save $10. She was losing, I don't know, $2,000 or $3,000 a year operating the Landmark, and it just stuck in her craw. She couldn't accept losing that money, and so she talked to her assistant, Marty something, I forget Marty's name, and said, call Dan Haley and see if he'll buy the Landmark. And so we made a deal to buy the Landmark for not a lot of money, but some. And part of our deal was that Judy had to keep writing her column, because we loved her column. She never, ever wrote a column about, I'm a great state treasurer because look what I did and did that and so on. She knew that no one in Riverside wanted to read that. So she would write columns about people she knew, people she grew up with, yard sales she'd been to, who died. It was like the ultimate local newspaper column. And she wrote that for us for several years, and I thought Judy was a great woman, died too young. One of the few Republicans I've ever voted for. Terrific woman. And then the other thing, we needed to be bigger. Running Wednesday Journal Oak Park River Forest by itself wasn't enough, wasn't big enough. We couldn't hire a full-time circulation person, we couldn't hire a full-time business manager. But the acquisition we made, that we paid a lot of money for, and that really changed our company, was Chicago Parent Magazine, which we bought from the two women who had started it. And Chicago Parent Magazine, in its glory years, which were, you know, a couple of decades, and it's still a fine magazine. We no longer own it. Chicago Parent made a lot of money, you know, by our standards. It was throwing off, you know, 20% margin and it allowed us to overinvest in the community papers, which is why I think our community papers have always been better than you might have expected them to be, because we had the Chicago Parent money to hire an extra reporter or add a few more pages. But we sold Chicago Parent a couple of years ago. Yes, it has been a wonderful ride. Being the editor and publisher is a fairly traditional role at a small paper. You get to bigger papers, traditionally, not so much right now, but you get to bigger papers and the publisher would typically be the person who would have come up on the sales side. They would have been much more focused on the business of publishing. Editors were considered to be too, idealistic to worry about whether circulation was up or down, or whether you should make a deal with a grocery store for more advertising. But in a small operation like we have been, editor and publisher together are pretty typical. I am actually really the editor of the Wednesday Journal. The Landmark has its own editor, Forest Park Review and Austin have their own editors. So the paper that I am most intimately involved with is the Oak Park River Forest paper. I'm involved to a lesser degree with the other ones. But in terms of where I spend time, it's really, as an editor, it's really on the Wednesday Journal. And it's been really interesting. When we were at our largest, which would have been in, 2005, 2008, we had started 2 papers in the city, South Loop, West Loop, called Chicago Journal. Chicago Journal in the South Loop, West Loop may have been the finest paper we ever published. It was beautiful. It was a broadsheet, not a tabloid, so it was tall and like the Tribune. We printed it on peach newsprint, which was not cheap, but as an idea we stole from a paper in New York City. We hired a old man from Brooklyn, I think, to design the paper, Phil Ritzenberg, Phil was, was in his 70s when we hired him. And I'm talking to him on the phone, I'm calling people up, newspaper designers. We'd never hired a newspaper designer before. And he said, so, tell me what it is. What do you want this to be? And I said, Phil, I want a paper that is, I told him it's broadsheet, it's on peach newsprint. He said, okay, whatever. Didn't quite get that. I said, I want a newspaper that is retro, but modern. And as I said that, I thought that is the stupidest thing a person could say. And he said, okay, I think I got that. And 2 weeks later, we flew him out from New York, and he brought all of these beautiful versions, and it was one handsome newspaper. We had a couple of people in our newsroom at that moment, young folks, who we promoted to work on the Chicago Journal. They were great. They were great. Great reporters, elegant writers. And for first couple of years, we were putting out fantastic weekly newspaper. It was newsy. It felt really local to that very unusual neighborhood at that point. City neighborhood coming out of nothing. Well, not out of nothing, but out of an old industrial past. It was wry. Brett McNeil, who was the editor, had a friend who he hired as a freelancer to write church reviews. And so we ran a weekly church review in which he would go in and review a performance like a play. And he would comment on the sermon and on the music and on the architecture. And it was done with a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, but also, you know, you could learn a lot. It was great stuff. But we were both too early and too late. We were too early because the South Loop and West Loop just hadn't quite arrived as residential communities. And we were too late because as that finally started to happen over the 5 or 7 years that we published those papers, the newspaper habit was dying, especially among the younger people who were living there. And we ran into the incredible recession of 2008. And so right around then, we had the 2 papers in the city that we had started and that I loved. We bought the last 4 Lerner newspapers in captivity from the Sun-Times. And so we were publishing 9 weekly newspapers and Chicago Parent out of these offices. And we had 75 employees, and we were rocking. So that was the biggest we ever were, 75 people. Now we are all different because we have become a nonprofit in the last year and a half, Growing Community Media. We sold Chicago Parent. The Lerner papers and the other city papers, we either closed them or gave them away, except for Austin Weekly. So we are now 17 people. We are kind of back to where we were 2 or 3 years in the early 80s. So it is a wholly different experience, and I am, because of that, a lot closer to the sales operation, to the editorial operation, because we have just thinned out so much. And it's great. It's not how I would have pictured this happening. But it's like a startup all over again.
Oh, what a journey, McKinley.
Yes.
Such persistence and commitment.
And starting a newspaper as a boy, and then continuing that commitment as a man to his community. It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. Okay, so I'm just looking forward to seeing part 2 of Dan's story. It will post on October 19th. If you're not on Open Doors Constant Contact list, email us at opendoor902@gmail.com and ask to be added to the list. The link will be mailed on October 19th. It will also be available on our website the same day. Click on the Backstory Project for the link to Dan Haley's Part 2.
And before we leave, we'd really like to thank Dan for sharing his story, and we'd like to thank you for listening. And once again, if this story matters to you, please make a donation to Open Door. Just visit our website at www.opendoortheater.net and click on that donate button. Any amount is greatly appreciated. Thank you.